I didn't think the small-town Midwest could harbor such darkness. Our community was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, where unlocked doors were a sign of trust, not naivety. But trust can be shattered, and evil wears many faces. It started with Emily. She was the local librarian, a kind soul with a laugh like summer rain. Her absence was noticed immediately. She never missed a day at the library. When the police found her, it was too late. She'd been strangled in her home, her body left in a grotesque tableau, as though the killer wanted to send a message. A note was pinned to her chest, scrawled in red ink. "This town hides its secrets too well." We were terrified, of course, but still naive. We assumed it was someone passing through, a drifter. We couldn't imagine it was one of us. Weeks passed, and then it happened again. This time it was Tim, the owner of the diner. His body was discovered in the freezer, bound with duct tape, his eyes wide open, staring into the void. A similar note was found on the counter: "They will all pay." By then, the town was in a frenzy. Curfews were imposed, and the streets became ghostly silent after sundown. Still, the murders continued. 4 more victims in the span of 3 months, each killed in increasingly brutal ways. Each time, the same chilling note, as if the killer was taunting us. The cops were clueless. They brought in outside investigators, FBI agents, but nothing seemed to stick. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no pattern to the victims other than their prominence in our community. I remember the news crews descending like vultures, turning our grief into spectacle. I tried to keep my head down. I worked nights at the gas station on the edge of town, a quiet job, usually just filling tanks and restocking shelves. But after the murders started, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It was the little things at first. Footprints in the snow behind the station, the faint smell of cigarettes lingering even though I didn't smoke. Then came the phone calls. Heavy breathing on the other end, nothing else. I told myself it was paranoia, that the murders had made me jumpy. Until the night I met him. It was close to midnight when the man walked in. He looked ordinary, which was the scariest part. Average height, average build, clean-shaven with a neutral expression. He bought a pack of gum and paid in cash. But as he handed me the bills, he said, "You should lock the door when you're working alone." I froze. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, but something in his eyes sent a chill down my spine. They were empty, like he was looking through me. I stammered a thank you and watched him leave. When I got home that night, there was a note pinned to my door. "I'm watching." I didn't sleep. How could I? I called the police, but they were stretched thin already. They sent an officer to take a report, but that was it. I felt like a sitting duck. The next night, he came back. This time, he didn't buy anything. He just stood at the counter, smiling at me. "You seem nervous," he said. I couldn't answer. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the pen I'd been using to jot down inventory. He picked it up and handed it to me, his fingers brushing mine. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not here for you." Not yet. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed. When he finally left, I locked the door behind him and called the cops again. They promised to send someone, but by the time the officer arrived, the man was long gone. Days turned into weeks. I didn't see him again, but I knew he was still watching. Notes kept appearing in places only I would find. Inside my car, taped to my bathroom mirror. They were all variations of the same message. Soon. I started noticing other things, too. My neighbor's dog barking incessantly in the middle of the night. A shadow moving past my window when I was sure I was alone. I even found footprints outside my bedroom window one morning, despite living on the 2nd floor. The final straw came when I found my cat, Bella, dead on my doorstep. Her neck had been snapped, her body arranged like the others. A note was pinned to her collar: "You can't hide." I packed a bag that night and drove to the nearest city. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my parents. I stayed in a cheap motel, jumping at every sound, unable to relax. But the notes followed me there too. The last one I received was different. It was inside my motel room, left on the pillow while I was out getting food. "You're fun to play with," it read, "but now it's someone else's turn." I never went back to that town. I read about it in the news a few months later. The murders stopped after I left, but no one was ever caught. The case went cold, the media moved on, and the town tried to rebuild. I'm in a new city now, with a new job and a new name. I've tried to move on, but I know he's still out there. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I heard his voice whispering my name, and every time I check the mail, I brace myself for another note.
Story number 2.
When I was a kid, I lived in a rural part of Georgia, surrounded by woods and endless dirt roads. Our house was an old farmhouse that creaked and groaned with age, the kind of place where silence felt heavier than sound. My parents often worked late, leaving me alone after school. I didn't mind. I liked the solitude, until I didn't. It started with the footsteps. They came at night, soft and deliberate, pacing back and forth on the second floor. At first, I thought it was just the house settling or my imagination running wild. But they were too rhythmic, too human. The problem was, the second floor was abandoned. My parents had closed it off years ago after the roof started to sag, and I wasn't allowed up there. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I crept up the staircase, each step groaning under my weight. The door to the second floor was padlocked, but I pressed my ear to the wood and listened. The footsteps stopped, as if the person or thing knew I was there. I whispered, "Hello?" No response. Then a faint scraping sound like nails dragging across the floor. I bolted back down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I told my parents. They brushed it off as a bad dream and scolded me for going near the locked door. "That floor's unsafe," my dad said. "Stay away from it." But the footsteps didn't stop. They became more frequent, louder, and sometimes I swore I heard whispering. One night, while my parents were working late, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the pale glow of the moon through the windows. I was sitting in the living room, clutching a flashlight, when I heard it. The sound of someone coming down the stairs. The flashlight beam trembled as I aimed it at the staircase. The footsteps stopped halfway down, just out of sight. I could feel someone, or something, watching me from the shadows. I screamed. My parents arrived home shortly after, finding me huddled in a corner, shaking. They searched the house but found nothing. My dad even checked the second floor, swearing the padlock was still intact. But I knew better. The final straw came a week later. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the now familiar sounds of pacing upstairs when I heard my bedroom door creak open. I froze, unable to move or breathe. The air grew icy, and a foul smell like rotting meat filled the room. Then a voice, a low, guttural whisper, said my name. I jumped out of bed and ran to my parents' room, but they weren't there. Frantic, I grabbed the phone and called my mom. She answered on the first ring. "Mom," I sobbed, "there's someone in the house." Her voice was calm but confused. "Sweetie, what are you talking about? We're right downstairs." The line went dead. I slowly turned to face the stairs, where the footsteps were now descending again. But this time, I saw it. A figure stood at the bottom of the staircase, shrouded in darkness. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong on any human face. It took a step toward me, and I ran, bolting out the front door and into the woods. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I collapsed near the edge of the forest. A neighbor found me the next morning, shivering and covered in scratches. My parents moved us out of the house the following week, but I still dream about that night. Sometimes I wake up hearing those same footsteps, pacing just outside my door.
Story number 3.
When I was 20, I took a summer job as a night security guard at an old hospital slated for demolition. The place had been closed for years, and the townsfolk whispered about its dark history. They claimed it was haunted, but I didn't believe in ghosts. I was a broke college student, and the paycheck was all I cared about. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. The job was simple: walk the halls every hour, make sure no squatters or vandals had broken in, and then sit at the desk monitoring the cameras. Easy money, or so I thought. The first few nights were uneventful, though the hospital gave me the creeps. It was cold, even in the middle of summer, and the smell of antiseptic still lingered in the air. The building groaned with age, and every sound echoed like a scream in the silence. On my 5th night, things started getting strange. Around 2 a.m., I was doing my rounds when I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the pediatric ward. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness as I cautiously walked toward the noise. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until I reached one of the patient rooms. The door was ajar, and the sound was coming from inside. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty except for an old hospital bed and a small wooden chair. The tapping had stopped, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something on the wall. A series of small, childlike handprints smeared in what looked like dried blood. My stomach churned, and I bolted back to the security desk. I tried convincing myself it was a prank, that someone had snuck in and left the handprints to scare me. But when I checked the cameras, the hall outside the pediatric ward was empty. The rest of the night was eerily quiet. The next evening, I almost didn't go back, but the thought of losing the paycheck forced me to suck it up. Everything was fine until about 3 a.m. when I saw movement on one of the monitors. It was the pediatric ward again. A figure stood at the end of the hall, just out of focus. It was small, no taller than a child, and it wasn't moving. I stared at the screen, waiting for it to do something, but it just stood there. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the ward, my heart pounding. When I reached the hall, it was empty, but the air was freezing, and that antiseptic smell was stronger than ever. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard it. A soft giggle, high-pitched and unnervingly close. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. I didn't sleep when I got home that morning. The next night, the activity escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own, lights flickered despite the building having no power, and my radio crackled with static, interrupted by faint whispers. But the worst was yet to come. At around 4 a.m., I was walking past the old operating rooms when I saw her. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, stood in the center of the hallway. She wore a hospital gown that hung loosely from her small frame, and her hair was matted and dirty. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though her neck was broken. She looked at me with wide, empty eyes and smiled, a grin too wide for her face. "Will you play with me?" she asked, her voice echoing like it came from a deep well. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. When I scrambled to pick it up, she was gone. That was the last straw. I left the hospital and never went back. I quit the job the next morning, and when my boss asked why, I lied and said it was personal reasons. I didn't want to sound crazy. A month later, I read in the news that the hospital had been demolished, but even now, years later, I can't forget that little girl. Sometimes I still hear her voice in my dreams. Will you play with me?
Story number 4.
Last summer, I moved into a cheap apartment on the outskirts of Chicago. It wasn't much, a small studio in an old brick building, but it was all I could afford. The landlord warned me about the building's quirks, creaky pipes, thin walls, and an elevator that worked when it felt like it. He didn't mention the whispers. The first night, I chalked it up to my imagination. As I lay in bed, I thought I heard faint murmurs, like a conversation just out of earshot. I assumed it was my neighbors and went to sleep, but the whispers didn't stop. Every night around 3 a.m., I'd wake to the sound of low voices. They weren't coming from the walls or the hallway. They were inside my apartment. I tried everything to catch them, staying awake, keeping the lights on, and even recording audio on my phone. But every time I pressed play the next morning, the recording was silent. After a week, I started noticing other things. Items in my apartment would move overnight. My keys, which I always left on the kitchen counter, would be on the coffee table. The chair at my desk would be pulled out, even though I hadn't used it. And then there was the mirror. I had an old, full-length mirror propped up against the wall near my bed. One night, I woke up to see my reflection standing at an odd angle, staring at me. I froze, unable to breathe. My reflection didn't mimic my movements. It just stood there, smiling. I don't know how long I stared at it before I grabbed my blanket and threw it over the mirror. The whispers that night were louder than ever. The next day, I went to my landlord. "Have there been issues with this apartment?" I asked, trying not to sound paranoid. He sighed and avoided my gaze. "There's a history," he said reluctantly. "A woman who used to live there, she had some problems." "What kind of problems?" I pressed. "She claimed she was being watched," he admitted. "Said there were voices in the walls. Eventually, she just disappeared, left all her stuff behind. Cops never found her. I moved out that same day, leaving most of my belongings behind. Weeks later, I drove past the building out of curiosity. The windows of my old apartment were dark, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing there, watching me. It was smiling.
Story number 5.
When I was 16, my family moved to a small, run-down house in the middle of nowhere, Maine. It wasn't our choice. My dad's job had relocated him, and this was all we could afford. The house was old, with peeling wallpaper, creaky floors, and a basement we weren't supposed to use because of structural issues. From the moment we moved in, I felt uneasy. There was something about the place that didn't sit right, like it was watching us. My parents dismissed it as nerves about the move, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It started with the basement door. Every morning I'd find it slightly ajar, even though we never went down there. My mom blamed the draft, but I wasn't so sure. One night I decided to lock the door before bed. The next morning it was open again, the lock still latched. Then came the voices. I'd hear them at night, faint murmurs rising from the floorboards. They were indistinct at first, like a distant radio, but over time they became clearer. Let us out. The first time I heard those words, I froze. My room was directly above the basement, and the voice was coming from below. I told my parents, but they laughed it off. "You're just hearing the house settling," my dad said. But I knew better. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I crept downstairs while my family slept. The basement door stood wide open, the darkness beyond it yawning like a mouth. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something compelled me forward, a pull I couldn't resist. The basement was colder than I expected, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing nothing but cobwebs and old shelves. Then I saw it. At the far end of the basement, scratched into the concrete floor, was a series of strange symbols. They looked ancient, like something out of a history book. In the center of the markings lay a small wooden box, bound with chains. As I approached, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Let us out!" I knelt beside the box, my hands trembling. The chains were rusted but intact, the padlock old and worn. Without thinking, I reached for it. The moment my fingers touched the lock, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a weight. Then, a voice, louder and clearer than before, spoke. "Don't." I whipped around, but no one was there. My flashlight flickered and the temperature plummeted. Panicking, I ran back upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. The next morning, the door was open again, the chain on the box in the basement broken. I begged my parents to move, but they dismissed my fears as teenage dramatics. A week later, my little brother Sam disappeared. We searched the house, the yard, the surrounding woods, but he was gone. The police found no signs of forced entry, no clues as to where he went. The night after Sam vanished, I heard him calling from the basement. "Help me." I refused to go down there, no matter how much the voice pleaded. It wasn't him. I knew it wasn't him. My family moved out a month later. The house still stands, abandoned and rotting, but I can't bring myself to drive past it. Sometimes, late at night, I hear Sam's voice in my dreams. "Why didn't you save me?"
Story number 6.
3 years ago, I rented a cabin deep in the woods of West Virginia for a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be a break from city life, a chance to unplug, hike, and maybe write a little. The cabin was rustic but cozy, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The first day was peaceful. I spent the afternoon hiking, listening to the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of birds. By dusk, I was back at the cabin, lighting a fire and settling in with a book. That night, everything changed. I woke up to a strange sound, a rhythmic tapping on the window near my bed. My heart skipped a beat. The cabin was isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor. I told myself it was a branch brushing against the glass, but when I peered out, there was nothing. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I went back to bed, but the tapping resumed an hour later. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to check. The cold air bit at my skin as I circled the cabin, but I found no branches, no animals, nothing that could explain the noise. I went back inside and locked the door, double-checking the windows. The next day, I hiked farther into the woods, trying to shake the unease. About 2 miles in, I stumbled across something strange. A small clearing with a circle of stones at its center. The ground inside the circle was charred, as if something had burned there recently. As I stood there, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over me. I felt like I was being watched. That night, the tapping returned, but now it came from all the windows, as if something or someone was circling the cabin. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, clutching a kitchen knife, my ears straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. Around midnight, the tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural voice outside the door. "Let me in." The voice was inhuman, a distorted growl that sent a chill down my spine. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, as the voice repeated, "Let me in." I don't know how long it went on, but eventually the voice stopped and the forest fell silent again. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things and loaded them into my car, but when I turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. It had worked fine the day before. Panic set in as I realized I was stranded. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal this deep in the woods. I spent the day trying to fix the car, but by nightfall, I had no choice but to go back into the cabin. That night was the worst. The tapping was relentless, come from every window and even the roof. The voice returned, now louder and more insistent. Let me in. At one point, I heard the door handle rattle. I ran to the bathroom and locked myself inside, clutching the knife. And then the whispering started. It was inside the cabin now, a chorus of voices, soft and menacing, surrounding me. You shouldn't have come here. I stayed in that bathroom until dawn, too terrified to move. When the sun finally rose, the whispers stopped, and the forest seemed almost normal again. I ran back to my car, and this time it started without issue. I drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I later learned that the cabin had a history. Decades ago, it was the site of a series of disappearances, and locals whispered about rituals and a cult. I'll never know what I encountered that weekend, but I've never gone camping or hiking since. Sometimes late at night, I hear faint tapping on my apartment windows. I live on the 5th floor.
Story number 7.
Last winter, I took a job as a caretaker for an elderly woman named Mrs. Whitaker. She lived in an enormous Victorian house on the edge of a small Massachusetts town. The house was beautiful but eerily quiet, with tall windows that seemed to watch you and shadows that clung to every corner. Mrs. Whitaker was in her late 80s, frail but sharp-minded. She spent most of her time in her sitting room, staring out at the snow-covered garden. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her words were strange. "They don't like strangers," she said one evening, her thin voice breaking the silence. "Who doesn't?" I asked. She didn't answer, just smiled faintly and turned back to the window. The first few nights were uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The creaking of the house kept me awake, and I often felt as if someone was standing just out of sight. Then, one night, I heard footsteps. They were soft but deliberate, moving through the hall outside my room. I assumed it was Mrs. Whitaker, though I couldn't imagine her walking without her cane. I got up to check on her, but when I peeked into her room, she was asleep. The footsteps continued. I followed the sound down the hall, my heart racing. It led me to a locked door at the end of the corridor, a door Mrs. Whitaker had specifically told me to avoid. "Don't go in there," she had said on my first day. "It's better that way." But now, the footsteps stopped right on the other side of that door. I pressed my ear to the wood. At first, there was silence, then a faint scratching sound like nails dragging across the surface. I backed away, my skin crawling, and returned to my room, locking the door behind me. The next day, I confronted Mrs. Whitaker. "What's behind that door?" Her expression darkened. "Things that shouldn't be disturbed," she said cryptically. "You'd do well to listen to me, dear." That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, this time accompanied by a low whispering. It was coming from the same locked door. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the hall. The whispers grew louder as I approached, a guttural language I couldn't understand. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. To my shock, it turned easily. The room beyond was pitch black. The air was damp and cold, carrying a smell of decay. I hesitated on the threshold, my flashlight beam trembling. Then, something moved. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, tall and twisted, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was featureless, except for two glowing, hollow eyes that bore into me. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The figure lunged toward me, and I slammed the door shut, locking it. The whispers turned into furious pounding, shaking the door on its hinges. I ran to Mrs. Whitaker's room, shaking her awake. "There's something in the house," I cried. She stared at me, her expression unreadable. "I told you not to open that door." The pounding stopped, and the house fell deathly silent. Mrs. Whitaker sighed and lay back down, closing her eyes. "It's your problem now," she murmured before drifting off to sleep. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things and left before dawn, driving as far away as I could. The house still stands, and sometimes I wonder if the thing behind the door is still there or if it's looking for me.
Story number 8.
In the summer of 2018, I took a solo road trip across the Southwest. One of my stops was a remote desert motel in Arizona. It was a small, rundown place with a flickering neon sign that read Desert Haven. The old man at the front desk gave me a room key without much conversation, and I settled into room 6 for the night. The room was what you'd expect: dim lighting, outdated furniture, and a faint smell of mildew. I was exhausted from driving all day, so I didn't think much of it. As I lay in bed, I noticed a peculiar detail. A large rectangular mirror hung on the wall directly across from the bed. Its frame was ornate but chipped, and the glass was slightly warped. I felt uncomfortable with it facing me while I slept, so I draped a towel over it before turning off the lights. That was my first mistake. At around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of faint scratching. It was subtle at first, like a mouse gnawing at wood, but it grew louder, more deliberate. I turned on the bedside lamp and scanned the room. Nothing seemed out of place, until I noticed the towel. It had fallen from the mirror. The glass was uncovered, and in the dim light, I thought I saw something move within its surface. Not a reflection, but something deeper, like shadows swimming behind the glass. I stared at the mirror for a long time, convincing myself it was a trick of the light. Finally, I forced myself to turn away and try to sleep. That was my second mistake. The scratching returned, louder this time, accompanied by a faint tapping sound. My heart raced as I sat up, staring at the mirror. The surface seemed to ripple like water disturbed by a breeze. Then I saw it, a pale hand pressing against the glass from the inside. I froze, unable to look away. The hand was followed by a face, twisted and hollow, with black, sunken eyes and a mouth that stretched unnaturally wide. It was watching me. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing my bag and keys. As I turned to leave, I heard a voice, a low, distorted whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Stay. I didn't. I bolted out of the room, leaving the door wide open, and jumped into my car. As I sped away from the motel, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The room's light was still on, and in the window, I saw a figure standing perfectly still. It wasn't me. The next morning, I called the motel to report what I'd experienced. The old man on the other end of the line sighed heavily. "You stayed in room 6, didn't you?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, my voice shaking. "It's the mirror," he said, his tone grave. "Been there since the place was built. People see things in it, things they shouldn't. Some don't make it through the night." "Why don't you get rid of it?" I demanded. He chuckled darkly. "Tried. It always comes back." I hung up and never looked back. To this day, I avoid mirrors at night. Sometimes I swear I catch a glimpse of that face in the corner of my eye.
Story number 9.
A few years ago, I took a job as a night security guard at an abandoned hospital in rural Pennsylvania. The building had been shut down for decades, but the owners were trying to preserve it for historical purposes. My job was to patrol the halls and ensure no one broke in. The hospital was massive, 4 stories of crumbling walls, peeling paint, and long, empty corridors. During the day, it was eerie enough. At night, it felt alive. My first week passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The building groaned and creaked constantly, but I told myself it was just the old structure settling. One night, I was doing my usual rounds when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways. I froze, shining my flashlight down the corridor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. I figured it must be a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten inside. Still, I decided to investigate. The sound led me to the second floor, to the old pediatric wing. The air here was colder, and the shadows seemed darker, thicker. As I walked, I noticed faint laughter, high-pitched and childlike. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The laughter stopped. At the end of the hallway, I saw a door slightly ajar, light spilling out from within. My heart pounded as I approached, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was an old playroom, filled with dusty toys and tiny chairs. In the center of the room sat a single doll, its porcelain face cracked, its glassy eyes staring at me. Then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam shaking. The laughter returned, louder this time, echoing all around me. Suddenly the doll's head turned, its unblinking eyes locking onto mine. "Play with us," a voice whispered, soft and menacing. I bolted out of the room, yanking the door open and running down the hall. The laughter followed me, growing louder and more distorted. When I reached the lobby, I stopped to catch my breath. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I saw it. In the reflection of the lobby's glass doors, a group of shadowy figures stood behind me. Small, childlike shapes with hollow eyes. I didn't turn around. I ran out of the building and never went back. The next day, I quit the job. I later learned that the hospital had been the site of a tragic fire in the pediatric wing. Several children didn't make it out. Sometimes I hear faint laughter when I'm alone at night. I try to convince myself it's my imagination, but deep down, I know better.